Okay, it is 12 o'clock and we're just getting all of the members signed in, but we will have time to go through. I have checked in with the members of the committee in terms of any items that they would like to speak to, and Councillor Van Holst, as a visiting councillor, were there any items that you wish to speak to as well? Great. So I have 2.3, 2.5, 2.8, 2.9, 212, and 213 as items that members have indicated that they wish to speak to. Councillor Usher, we'll start with you on 2.3, which is the wastewater operation equipment replacement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for the report. I just want to ask questions, and I don't want to make this too long. $750,000 sounds like a lot to me, especially the process that we're going through. Seems to me that in the beginning if I read this rightly, we took some money out of somewhere, and now we're short in that budget by that $750,000. So how do we compensate for that? Where is the $750,000 coming from now?
Through the chair. Yeah, so the original account amount was $1.3 million. That's an annual account that supports these wastewater treatment initiatives. And it was reduced to $300,000 as part of the CWF, so the Clean Water Wastewater Funding process. So we needed to have city funding to provide for our share of that funding that was supported by 75% of upper levels funding for that project. So unfortunately, we tried our best to manage within that very small amount of $300,000, and we found that there's a couple of large items that have come forward. So what we're going to be doing is taking that $750,000 from the reserve fund, and the good news is that we've done our mid-year monitoring, and we have a surplus in that monitoring. So we know that when we reconcile that surplus and money goes back into the reserve fund, that we'll have more than enough money to offset this $750,000 increase in funding that we need for this account.
So, through you, Madam Chair, if I'm reading this rightly, just in my mind, simple mind, we needed this money in order to be able to get that big bumps from the government to support it. So it's almost like a borrow, but not quite. And then now we realize that we can't just do without it, so we have to prop it up back, right? In essence, that's more or less. Okay, I got my answer. Thanks.
Thank you. And the clerk rightly reminded me I forgot to ask for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. I could say I was waiting for Deputy Mayor Hubert to arrive. That would be a lie, though. Are there any disclosures? Seeing none, we will proceed with 2.5. Councillor Usher, you had some questions on that as well. That's the Commissioner's Road West realignment.
First of all, Madam Chair, I want to congratulate staff on this. This is something that has been around for a long time, and we've did some remedial work on this some time ago. We spent a lot of money to sort of smooth it out. I remember the days when I used to drive down there, and I was very fearful in driving down there, and then we fixed it up, widened it, but it's still bad for a lot of people, particularly during the winter. So I want to congratulate staff on finding an alternative for that. Having said that, this pit, and I know this is a long-term project and we're going to have to do something with this site, but unless I'm misunderstanding this pit is relatively deep. And it seems to me that this new route is going right through the middle of the pit. So we're going to have to fill that up to bring it up to grade in order to accommodate what we're doing here.
Mr. McRae, are you able to provide some insight?
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair. The alternatives that were considered under the environmental assessment ranged in degree in their encroachment on the pit, and some required more fill and others required less, and that was balanced off with impacts to adjacent properties and whatnot. So there is a significant amount of fill required for the property. The intent of this environmental assessment is that it's a long-term planning study that can be, you know, it provides guidance to the Byron gravel pit secondary plan such that the future construction of the road can be done potentially in conjunction, coordination with development of the surrounding area. So how that unfolds is hard to say at this time. It's a long-term project, and as the development identified in the secondary plan begins to take shape, we would work further with the surrounding stakeholders to try to undertake that in the best, most efficient manner possible.
And Madam Chair, it makes a lot of sense to me that we are doing this first, and as we develop whatever we want to do with the pit, then we have this in place so that we know that this will be in place. It's not the other way around. And I sort of commend staff on that. I think it's a good plan, and I think that this is the way we need to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Usher and Mr. McCray. I'm going to go to items 2.8. Councillor Usher. Yep, you take your time, and just for anyone watching, 2.8 is the 2017 Community Energy and Greenhouse Gas Inventory, and it's starting on page 91 in the blue agenda.
I just need to catch my bearings with this one. Sorry, Madam Chair. Just any.
Quite all right, Councillor. I do have another member that wants to speak on this item. Do you wish for them to go first, maybe?
Let them go ahead, yeah.
Okay. Deputy Mayor Huber.
Sorry.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Just a question on, I'm on item 2.6, which is the Community Energy Action Plan, and particularly the comment on page 72 pertaining to what impact will new provincial government have, and it is not known at this time. I think it's really critical given the change of government and the change that we're going to be into here at the city, you know, in October, and then the transition the beginning of December, that we're tracking these changes and the financial implications of them, not just in this area, but certainly in the social services, infrastructure, all those sorts of things. And I'm very concerned that we're actually going to lose and track of some of that financial impact. And what the taxpayer won't know is that while the provincial governance coffers and balance sheet may look better, that the municipal coffer and balance sheet may not look so good, because we're going to be now covering a greater percentage of the costs of these things than we had initially hoped. Now, I know that in 2017, a lot of the programs were new. So I'd like to hear from staff just how we're tracking it. And then I know we're at Civic Works, but also, and we don't have anyone necessarily from finance here, how we're tracking it on a corporation-wide basis. And I will raise that again, and I'll become a bit of a sounding gong that you hear regularly on this until you get rid of me on the 1st of December, because at the end of the day, we don't have any options. We have to go to the taxpayer, the property tax base, and so I'd like to hear from staff on that.
Thank you. If we can get your mic, I'm giving staff a moment to collect their thoughts and decide who they're going to appoint to this question. It looks like it might be Mr. Stanford.
Through the chair, I'll start first, and then I would imagine that our city engineer will also comment. Specific to the report and many of the environmental initiatives, yes, we are in the land of uncertainty right now, I guess would be the way to describe it best. Fortunately, we saw some of this coming, and the impact is not as severe as it could have been. Over the years, we've basically been very cautious on how we've actually worked with provincial government and how the funding streams have looked in the past. So we're actually, at this point, really just sitting back and wondering what the current provincial government is going to do. And that is really what is the timing of what this particular report is. It's the Community Energy Action Plan. This phase is actually winding down. And as we create the next one with the community, we'll have much more information available. The councillor has pointed out, though, that it's one of those things with funding disappearing, where we might have to be very careful on expectations. And I think overall, we've always done that quite wisely at Civic Works Committee, is that even though it's another level of government, it's something there that it's still, at the end of the day, one taxpayer. So we've been very cautious in the past, and we will continue to do so and report out as we've been doing.
Deputy Mayor, did you want to speak to that before Ms. Scher or after? Go now.
So as we live in wonderment, it seems like all this seems to be in your department, Mr. Stanford, because I think 2 weeks or a month ago we were talking about the waste reduction and, I don't know whether you're doubly blessed or doubly cursed. I mean, you seem to get all of these very fun things. So I think it's just important that we track not just the initiative, but the financial implication of it. And, in days gone by with our audits, we always were looking at value for money. And this is a real value for money piece, and I think we need to watch it, or else we end up in the middle of Wonderland Road without a way to get across the road, and that's not a good thing, just to stay with your wonderment metaphor.
Thank you. I'll look to Ms. Scher if you have anything to add.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly, environmental and engineering services can work with housing and facilities and finance to come up with a mechanism to track where there's additional costs incurred by the municipality. I think the other thing that's important to remember is that potentially some of these programs simply will not proceed without financial support. So there's a lost opportunity cost, although no incurred actual financial impact to the community. The service simply doesn't exist.
And I think that's a really good point. It's not just actual dollar, but it's actually opportunity cost, where we were projecting a possibility or an opportunity. And I think our finance folks and could work to come up with a very simple scorecard where we're tracking that. And we need to be doing that across the corporation.
Thank you. I'm going to head back to item 2.8. Councillor Usher is ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question about 2.8 is to do with the goals that we've set for 2020, 2030, 2050. So my question would be, how does population growth play into this? London is steadily growing by a little less than 1% per year in terms of population, and I'll assume residential and commercial establishments and so on. And how do these goals play out with that? As we increase, is the proportion increase also?
Through the chair, in our report, we actually report both items. We do look at a per capita estimate, and we compare that back to 1990. But when it comes to the goals, that is basically the current information when it comes to greenhouse gas, what is being produced at that point in time. The goals that are in our report right now that have been endorsed by council, they were based on the provincial targets. And last week, there was information that came out from the current provincial government that they will be looking at those targets again in light of the federal government targets. So the timing actually is a good one here too. As we look into the future, there's likely to be perhaps some further alignment between the province and the federal government on these targets. And that'll be part of what we do with our next Community Energy Action Plan, and we'll be bringing back to the next council. Very much following the discussion that's here today, that we've got to be designing our go-forward programs based on what we can do here locally. But at the same time, when it comes to the larger projects, when you start changing the energy grid, that's something that's done at the provincial level. And if there's going to be changes there, that will impact our targets. And that'll be information that we bring back to you to let you know how that will change. But once again, whenever we can drive things locally, that is within the control of council. And that is always one of our priorities, is to do things here locally in the community. But we have to acknowledge that some things just have to be done on a regional, provincial, and national level.
So thank you very much, Mr. Stanford. My other question then, just to follow up, I don't remember with respect to the federal goals. Is the provincial goals more lenient than the federal, or vice versa? Do you remember?
Through the chair, on page 96 of our report, we actually have both the federal and provincial goals listed. And yes, the provincial goals are much more aggressive. And what we heard last week is that there may be some further alignment with the federal government. So that'll be something that we have very little information at this point in time, but that is something that we're tracking very closely along with the funding that we just talked about. Page 96 has a graph that shows the two levels.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stanford, and Councillor Usher for your questions on that. I'm prepared to move forward to the next item, 2.9, East London Sanitation Servicing Study, the Municipal Class EA Notice of Completion. Councillor Usher pulled that to make some comments. So I'll give you a second.
So thank you very much. This is quite an effort, quite a presentation. Again, it's we got a short term, which is apparently is over the next 20 years, and then we have a long term, which is further on. But with respect to the short term, which I believe is about $34 million, if I'm right, and then later on we go to the long term, which is over 300. Sorry, did I say 1,000? I meant million. And then we go to the long term, which is over 300 million. I'm just wondering, with respect to these, when do you see us? I know that it's way down out in the east end, but when do you see us starting this transformation? Because what I read here is that we're going to develop two sites, and ultimately we're going to combine these two sites in one location. And both of these cost a lot of money, and both of them seem to be very complicated, particularly the longer term. So I know I read the report, but could you just enlighten me a little bit as to how you see this unfolding?
Mr. Mathers, would you like to handle that?
Through the chair, absolutely. As you can see, we tried to take a look at the short term and the long term with any of these works, because we don't want to spend huge amount of money at one plant if we think eventually over the 20, 30, 50-year time frame that we're going to be replacing the plants. So I thought it was a huge benefit that we've looked at that 50-year plan, because now we know what to invest and what not to invest in these plants. In reality, the actual timing of the replacement of these treatment plants is highly variable based on the amount of growth that occurs in the city and the timing of that growth, and how the other initiatives that we're working on, like removing our combined sewers, trying to reduce the amount of water getting in from people's weeping tiles. If we can reduce those things and get a lot of great benefits, then we can also push out that timing as far as we can. So that 20-year, that short-term focus is really trying to get as much capacity out of that current locations that we have at the Vauxhall plant. We think we have very cost-effective ways of trying to get capacity, and that's, as you can see from the dollar amounts, of being between 34 and 75 million versus looking at something that's costs hundreds of millions of dollars. So we're going to try to get all that we can out of that value that's in those plants. So the timing of that next looking at the actual replacements of the plants, probably not going to be till later on in our period of probably 15 to 20 years from now, we'd be looking at the actual consolidation. But as far as moving forward, we really want to be able to tie this into all of the planning that we do throughout the water and wastewater system, and we feel that this is a good starting point. And then moving forward, we want to try to get that best bang for our buck with that equipment that we have today.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Van Holst, do you wish to add?
Thank you. Just have a question on that as to, I'm aware of some newer technologies that take up much smaller footprints, and wondering if this study will be looking into those as well. I mean, often we hire consultants, but they know a certain technology and are in favor of that. Are we going to get a vision into some of other opportunities as well?
Through the chair, absolutely. We're going to be opening up looking at a bunch of different like smaller footprint technologies. This actually aligns directly with our domestic action plan municipal goals as well for phosphorus reduction. So we have a few technologies that we started to look at. There may be some other ones that come available within the shorter term, but we'll be looking at implementing those as part of this upgraded at the Vauxhall plant.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. Just on the Vauxhall upgrade itself, part of Ward 4 drains down towards that plant, as you know. And in terms of the timeline for the expansion, are we looking at something like 2027, 2028 in terms of when it could be, up and operational and providing additional capacity?
Through the chair, we feel that there's some quite cost-effective things that we can do in the next 5 years. So a lot of the work in some of these plants isn't necessarily always spending a lot of money to make more structural improvements. Sometimes it's more of a paper-based exercise where we can get, as long as we can get improve the hydraulics in the plant, and we can show that to the Minister of Environment and be able to show them that you can put that flow through the plant, then we can get some of those capacity improvements before actually doing a huge amount of work. So the next stage of those improvements would probably be in the time frame that you're suggesting, but we think in the next 5 years, we could get some of those more cost-effective improvements.
Thank you, and that's certainly good news. In terms of the overflow events that are happening during wet weather, we were just talking about the climate change at the pieces earlier, and here's one impact of it, of course, which is the overflow events. Is that going to be resolved by these kind of optimizations that can happen in the plant, or is it going to have to really wait until the actual physical changes are made, more on like a 10-year time frame?
Through the chair, with any capacity improvement, that opens up opportunities to reduce the amount of water that's overflowing. So part of this plan looks at the actual plant and increasing the capacity, but then if we go back to the EA that we're completing as well, we're trying to look at different improvements throughout the collection system so we can reduce the amount of water even getting to the plant. So both of those things in tandem are going to help reduce those number of overflows that we're experiencing into the Thames River.
Councillor Usher. So we're going to move on then to the next item, which is 212. Councillor Squire.
I enjoyed getting this report, and particularly in terms of the bicycle lanes. And this came from somebody in the bicycling community, the question I'm going to ask. And the issue that was raised was whether it would be more advantageous, preferable for cyclists to actually clear something that's sort of citywide, like the Thames Valley Parkway. And I, of course, raised with that person that there'd be a huge budget implication on snow clearing the Thames Valley Parkway in the winter, although I appreciated the idea that it's across the city and it's important to cyclists. But I wonder if you could, and I know you may not have figures now, but can you give me an idea of the cost difference between what you're proposing here and something that would be on a larger scale like that, the Thames Valley Parkway? And if you can't give me the numbers today, it'd be interesting for me to have those, just because people are often saying to me, why don't you just clear the Thames Valley Parkway all winter? And my answer, it'd be great if I had some numbers or something to give to them so they knew the actual cost.
Through the chair, so off the top, it's not a matter of either or. Because the bike lanes are part of the right-of-way, they're subject to the minimum maintenance standards, and we need to do that work according to the standard that's in place. I don't have a number on the Thames Valley Parkway. I can have one for you for council. I'll confer with my colleagues in Parks and Rec because they do that work for us.
Just to follow up then, on the work that you've set out here, I know you've set out different projects that will be cleared, and the estimated cost is $410,000 per kilometer. Can you give me an idea of how many kilometers you're talking about doing here so I can do some simple math and see what the cost is?
Through the chair, the $410,000, it's just as a correction, it's not per kilometer. It's overall for the network that we're about to clear. The costs are associated by cost per kilometer to maintain certain classes of bike lane. For an example, I don't have the examples of the breakdown, but we have a number of kilometers, anything that's within the right-of-way. We already received some funding for it through growth. The $410,000 is to bring us up to the standard that's in the minimum maintenance standards, and that's what we feel will be appropriate. The cost is based on the cycling master plan cost, which we received from the consultant and other municipalities to give us a guideline on how much this will cost.
Just to follow up then, if I could have, be able to, and if this can be done by council, it'd be great. I think council's actually 2 weeks, which is great. Just so I can compare, you know, what's this going to cost versus what would the Thames Valley Parkway cost. I just would find that useful because people are always writing me saying, why don't you just clear this in the winter? Why don't you just clear this in the winter? And usually I say to them, yeah, that's a wonderful idea, but there's going to be a cost associated with it. And I'd love to be able to at least provide them in some kind of rough numbers what we're looking at, because I know snow removal is expensive, and I know keeping something like the Thames Valley Parkway open for cyclists in the winter would maybe, I don't know, maybe prohibitively expensive.
Through the chair, we certainly can provide some unit costs as well as total lengths before council.
If it's all right with the committee, I'd like to make a couple comments from the chair on this. So I am a director on the Ontario Good Roads Association. You'll note in the report that OGRA is tasked with providing input to the minimum maintenance standards for Ontario and for adoption. And so I just wanted to let committee and council and Londoners know that in the process of providing that input, I consulted with our staff and I was able to take back input from a London perspective to that table and to that discussion, which then got forwarded to the province. In regards to the report in Part C, do we, and maybe it's more Part A, but Part C is referencing Part A, do we have an option to not follow the minimum maintenance standards? And what are the risks and liabilities should we not adopt the minimum maintenance standards as our maintenance standards?
Through the chair, I don't know of any other municipalities that are not following the minimum maintenance standards, so you'd be setting ourselves apart from the rest of our peers. It'd be hard to measure what the difference would be. Our level of service that we provide now fits well within the minimum maintenance standards. We've been following them since 2003, and these amendments here provide betterment for safety and fall within the level of service that we're capable of providing.
And thank you. And I did know that and just kind of wanted to highlight that point that the minimum maintenance standards are the minimum as set by the province and people should all be following them. We as a city or as a municipality could make decisions based on budget, which might set our standard to be slightly improved than the minimum maintenance standard. And I think that's a discussion for budget time and based on specific proposals. But to me, there was no question in terms of adopting the minimum maintenance standards. We're more or less required to do so, and not doing so, I think, would put us in a liability should there be injury or accident. So I was just surprised to see that in there because to me, it's just what we follow because we have to follow, but I'm happy to formalize the adoption of that. And work with council to look at other improvements that we may wish to make through the budget process. Councillor Usher, did you have another comment on this one?
Yes, Madam Chair. I just want to go back to a point that Mr. Parsons made with respect to, I think it's on page 126. Really, it's about the $410,000. Does that mean that the way this is written is not totally accurate, this paragraph? Because it says that the estimated cost per kilometer for the service level, for this increased service level, is identified to be estimated at $410,000. Is that, did you say that that's not really accurate?
Could you clarify perhaps the intent behind that statement or what it should read?
If I may, Madam Chair, I think the intent of the sentence was to say that using the per kilometer costs, we've come up with a total cost of $410,000. It is not $410,000 per kilometer. That would be highly excessive. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to clarify that. It is a confusing sentence.
So all I'm asking then is that should we, because that's not what this is saying, and I just want that when it comes to council that this be clarified. The public should realize that it's a total figure and not $410,000. I'm not trying to make trouble. I'm just saying that other people read this and we need to really clarify it. Do you mind?
Madam Chair, I confer with this clerk's office about the easiest way to manage that process. Certainly, the sentence itself does lend it to suggest that's a per kilometer versus we did a per kilometer estimate to come up with the totals. So I apologize again for the grammatical challenge, and if clerks could give us advice on how to amend that prior to council, we certainly would be receptive.
So can we look to the clerk to offer some clarification for that before council?
So the recommendation is that we add an "it being noted" to the clause that we're passing today. So we'll be passing all of the consents and adding an "it being noted" in regards to 2.12 that the total cost is estimated at $410,000. Thank you, Councillor Usher. Councillor Squire, did you want to speak on 213?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
I have to admit, through the chair, I had a lot of fun reading this report, primarily because the generosity of the federal government is quite incredible in terms of letting us spruce up the rail crossings that we're spending millions and millions and millions of dollars, I think $60 million to go under the Adelaide tracks on Adelaide. So, you know, I think it's a little misleading, or it makes things sound better than they are. I mean, we're going to plant some flowers and brush up paint the fixtures. You know, really that doesn't solve the fundamental problem that we're spending, you know, London tax dollars on, and that's going under the railways. And this is no fault of our staff. I just find it kind of humorous to see this kind of money as if it's just a drop in the bucket compared to the real costs that London's incurring to deal with these issues.
Were you looking for a response or just comment? Okay. Thank you. Is there any other comments on 213? Okay, so Councillor Usher is going to move it. I think Deputy Mayor Hubert's going to second it, and we are going to put that "it being noted" clause, and we'll get that up on screen. I do note, I think that there's some members of the media in the second floor or in the gallery. If you would like to, you are welcome to come down here, but you are welcome to stay up there as well. I just thought this was a good opportunity as we're going to reset into some scheduled items coming up. So we'll get that motion on the screen. So the motion is up on screen. It is more than adequate, a little bit more than pretty good. And the "it being noted" will show up on the council minutes.
Closing the vote, motion passed 5-0.
Thank you very much. Yes, Councillor Usher? Can we have your microphone? I think Councillor Usher has a
Before
quick
Mr.
announcement.
Parson and Mr. Wills go, I have a question that I would like to ask him at the business. Would you allow me to do that now, before they leave? It's a simple question. For Mr. Parson and Mr. Wills.
I'm just wanting to make sure that it doesn't prevent us from addressing any other new business later on, and maybe look at the committee to see if anyone else has any other additional business, or, okay. So I'm comfortable with making that change now so that they can get off to work.
Okay. It's to do with a water break that happened in the White Oaks area over the weekend. And I was flabbergasted that I was inundated with telephone calls and emails over the weekend. And I didn't have an answer. I started asking these people as a sort of putting them off to give me permission to pass this over to staff. So I never did pass it over to staff. My problem is that in speaking to some of the folks, nobody knew what was happening, including myself, because all I got was that our water is rusty and we don't have any drinking water. We didn't know exactly what was happening. It was not until 8 minutes to 8 last night that I got a report to say that I think it was fixed. So what I'm trying to ask, and this is what my constituents are asking me, if there's a quicker way of reporting this, because none of the people in the southern White Oaks area knew what was happening. They just knew that when they turned their tap on, the water was rusty. They didn't know how long it was going to be. And I'm just bringing this message on their behalf to this committee to find out if there's a quicker way of reporting this for the residents to find out about it. I don't have all their emails, so even if you send it to me, I wouldn't be able to send it to everyone unless I start walking up and down the street and identify. One person, and the reason I asked Mr. Wills to stay is that one person even identified to me that they started drinking the water before they noticed that it was rusty, and they washed their 2-week-old baby clothes in this water, and now they have to go out and buy new clothes, and they wanted to send us a bill. So I said, well, if you want to do it, you have to send me an email, and then I'll pass it on to our risk management. I don't think that they will send it, but that's the excuse that I gave them. So I just bring this forward and wonder if there's an answer, if there's a way that we could, when something like this happens, it's an emergency, if we could get the word, especially on a weekend, if we could get the word out to the affected residents quicker.
I think I'm going to start with Mr. Mathers on that, or Ms. Scher, about if you could give us a synopsis of what happened. I know Councillor Usher touched on it a little bit, as well as future communication plans, and if there are any changes that you're considering.
Through the chair, so yesterday, early in the evening, there was a water main break on Meg Drive. What commonly happens, which you probably have all heard in the past, is when you have one of these large water main breaks, it causes a lot of movement in old pipes. The rust on the edge of those pipes can become freed up into the water column, which then results in having yellow or brown water at your tap. First thing I want to say is that the water is completely safe. It is disinfected. However, it can have an adverse impact on your laundry if you're doing laundry at the time. So when this occurred, it had a fairly large spatial impact, not just in that one little area in Meg Drive, so it did impact a lot of people. People were calling the after-hours line, and it got to the point where the line was overwhelmed and people weren't able to be answered. So in the future, if you do have experienced this type of thing, I would urge you to reach out to myself, and if it's a water or a wastewater related item, and I'll make sure that we put people in the right contact. What we do want to improve is how we communicate this in the next, when this happens next time. So we were able to get some postings through social media by about 8 o'clock that night, but by that point, the water main break was for the most part repaired, and it was kind of an after impact. So what we'd like to do is to try to get that out ahead of time. We did reach out to communications, and we had some difficulty in getting the social media in a timely manner. So we're going to work on that for next time this occurs, and but absolutely reach out to other staff members as well if you do have this incident, have something like this happen in the future.
And I accept that and I appreciate it. Unfortunately, my residents don't accept that, and because I said to them pretty much the same thing. Here's an example that they gave me, through you, Madam Chair. They said, when there's a tornado coming, everybody knows about it very quickly, instantly. And they say, why is it that we couldn't know about this with the water break? I'm not here to give them an answer for that. You know, they're sitting there at home. This individual that mentioned that to me just brought a 2-week-old baby home, and that's what they're telling me. So I'm just asking that in the process of reviewing that communication, if we could look at that, that's a provincial government, I fully understand that. But if we could look at a way of instantly advising people, hey, there's a problem with the water, it's going to be fixed, don't drink it, or whatever we want to do, quicker, because it's not everybody has access to email. I certainly don't have everybody's email. And I just think that in fairness to them, this is a small area. If it happened on Meg Drive, it was really some of the people on Nicholas and some of the other streets way north of that called me about this. So it must have affected quite a few blocks, almost all the way up to Southdale. And I just need for them to be satisfied that we're going to do something. We're going to look at this communication system. I think it's worth it if people are asking for it. So that's what I'm bringing here and asking you to take into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Usher. I received calls about this even in Ward 10 yesterday, and so I understand that it was a concern to people, and I'll trust that staff will take a look at communication processes. The one thing I would like to say, and perhaps have staff confirm or disagree with me, is if there was a risk to the health of the people of London via the drinking water, would the response and communication have been different and more immediate?
Through the chair, absolutely. If there was any kind of a danger, we would be going door to door to be able to notify people of this. And that's maybe why there wasn't as large of a distribution of this communication. It wasn't as urgent as maybe a tornado or having an issue with the water. But that doesn't mean that we can't do a better job at communicating this anyway. So I'm going to take this feedback back and then provide a better outcome next time.
If I may, Madam Chair, further to what Mr. Mathers said, I know the Director of Communications is looking at better ways to align 24/7 services with a communication shop that typically is more Monday to Friday business hours. And I think you'll be hearing more on that front in the time to come. We certainly see those challenges with, it seems when something's going to break in our world, it tends to never happen between 8:30 to 4:30 Monday to Friday. So we definitely need that ability to contact residents in a more thorough way. And as Mr. Mathers noted, we certainly will door knock if there's a risk to public safety as well.
I certainly appreciate it. I just want staff to understand that I'm bringing a message from my constituents. It's not just one of them, but many of them. And I think that one of the big problem here was because it was on a Sunday. And in fact, one of them even told me that they have been reaching out to Hydro all day. I said, why Hydro? But I understand afterwards because when they get the bill, they pay the water through Hydro. So that was the only way that they knew. But I did, those who got in touch with me by email, when I got the report last night at 8 o'clock, I did send this to them, but it was only a few of them at the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Usher, and thank you to staff. So I think we're ready to move into 3.1. Which is the Complete Streets Design Manual. And Ms. Scher, do you have additional staff here that we haven't had the opportunity to meet yet that you would like to introduce us, or would you like to hold off?
Madam Chair, we do, and I'm going to ask Mr. McCrae to introduce his team members.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to introduce the Complete Streets team. We have Michelle Morris and Majid Al-Madoun. In particular, Michelle has been very diligent. When this initiative started, she was with Transportation Planning and Design. Michelle is an engineer in training, and that program aims to create the most well-rounded engineers possible. So the engineers rotate through different service areas within EES and other divisions. So Michelle is now with water engineering, but has been dedicated to this initiative and has followed it through in her current role. So I'd like to welcome Michelle.
Welcome, Michelle. Trust Matt will get you set up with the presentation and we'll flip on screen. Sorry, someone was making your job harder. Do you have the red light on now?
Yes.
Okay,
I
welcome.
think everyone can hear me. So thank you to Doug for that introduction. I am an engineer in training in water engineering. So I'm here to speak on the Complete Streets Design Manual. And the project team has included, so everyone in engineering and planning has been a part of this. So it is a diverse project that I've been able to work on. So to introduce complete streets, a complete street accommodates the mobility needs of every type of user. So this means that consideration is given to the variety of ages, abilities, and modes of travel. So London is already implementing the complete streets design philosophy on a lot of our streets as envisioned in the London Plan. And the Complete Streets Design Manual will formalize and standardize how that philosophy is implemented in London. So as part of the Complete Street Design Manual development, significant consultation efforts were carried out. So we received feedback from over 28 different stakeholder groups and from the general public during a period of public review. And just a few of the consulted stakeholder groups are identified on this slide. And we held a full day consultation event in June of 2017, where we introduced Complete Streets and introduced the direction of the manual. And at a later stage of the study, we also provided follow-up presentations to a number of groups. And we received a lot of support during consultation, and we were able to incorporate valuable feedback into the manual. So in 2016, the London Plan introduced these 8 street classifications for the roads in London. And it also introduced Table 6, which identifies which design elements should be found on each street classification. And these 8 street classifications are used to classify all of the existing streets in London and all of the future streets. And the Complete Streets Design Manual takes these street classifications and the information from Table 6 and expands that into visual cross-sections. These cross-sections will provide an illustration of how the different elements can fit together. So these are the 6 chapters of the Complete Streets Design Manual. So in this presentation, we're going to briefly highlight some of the key features of the manual. So over the past few years, the city and council has implemented a number of really great initiatives to make London a great and safe city. So the Complete Streets Design Manual further builds on all of these existing initiatives. So we have an example cross-section of a Civic Boulevard here to show you. So again, we took the high-level information from the London Plans, Table 6, and created these detailed cross-sections for designers to implement. And an example of a Civic Boulevard would be Adelaide Street or Commissioners Road. And due to the typical volume and motor vehicle speeds on these roads, continuous and physically separated pedestrian and cycling facilities are the preferred design. And so this is a rendering of a rapid transit boulevard intersecting a main street. So the intersection renderings are helpful to show how a rapid transit boulevard, which has a priority for transit, can safely intersect a main street that has a priority for pedestrians. And strategies for minimizing conflict within intersections include maximizing the visibility of all the users, reducing motor vehicle speeds through the intersection, and providing abundant pedestrian space. So implementation of the Complete Streets Design Manual will have negligible impacts on the development charges because the cost of some street elements will be offset by narrower pavement widths of some streets. And the Complete Streets Design Manual illustrates cycling facilities on some neighborhood connectors. This will be subject to the Cycling Master Plan updates. And there will be additional project management pressures when implementing the Complete Streets design philosophy on existing residential neighborhoods. And there will also be a requirement to coordinate the Complete Streets design manual with other process updates such as the Design Standards and Requirements Manual and the resolutions for the official plan appeals. In terms of property requirements, the right-of-way widths shown in the Complete Street Design Manual are consistent with the London Plan. And for reconstruction of streets with constrained property, we have priority setting tools to optimize the property impacts for those projects. So thank you for the time to let me present, and I guess we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, just make sure you hit your microphone off there, and we'll start with Councillor Squire and then Usher.
Thank you very much for this. Probably the most common issue that arises for me as a councillor when I'm out in the community is the safety of neighborhood streets. And primarily that's around the issue of speed of what are neighborhood streets. In other words, not connectors, but streets within a neighborhood. And you constantly hear people saying, the speeds are high on these streets, what can you do? And I have to admit, you know, we do traffic calming, which I'm probably not the #1 fan of speed bumps. But maybe you can help me as we move along. How is this going to help with those kind of streets? Because I know in North London, which I represent, a street, William Street, for instance, has been narrowed with outcrops sort of coming out so that, and raised intersections. I wonder if you can just expand a little bit on how we're going to make the sort of more local neighborhood street safer for everyone involved.
Okay, I'm going to look at where that's going. Mr. McRae, do you want to come up to the podium or speak from there? That works as well, if everyone wants to grab a seat. And Mr. McRae, do you want to grab this one?
Yes, thank you. We are certainly cognizant of the concerns the councillor is expressing. It's something that transportation deals with on a daily basis, and it's been a focus area of the Complete Streets Design Manual, and that it's shifting a focus from you know, a transportation purpose into more of a public space kind of approach. And so as Michelle mentioned during the presentation, narrower road widths are embedded throughout the different street classifications, including neighborhood streets, which are also in the old system known as local streets. And so that is one way that that speeds can be maintained without having to then afterwards retrofit in physical traffic calming measures. That said, the document also does discuss traffic calming, and where appropriate, items like raised intersections can be appropriate, and it opens the door. It's not prescriptive. Obviously, every street is unique to its neighborhood, and so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but it's certainly very cognizant of making streets more, you know, fit in better with the surrounding neighborhood and being conducive to all forms of transportation, so transit, walking, and cycling.
Yeah, I have to say to you, Madam Chair, that I really like this approach, which is let's do something to a street that makes sense for the neighborhood rather than doing, you called it retrofitting. I suppose that's a way of putting it, but I think the thing is that a properly built street should be able to address the concerns of the neighborhood. And sometimes the traffic calming that comes later is very divisive and very difficult. So I really like this approach. I think it's great. I, of course, hope that people will understand in the community that everything is part of infrastructure renewal. And I assume, I guess this will be my last question, I assume these streets are changed as we do infrastructure work on a street in any event. For instance, I use the example of William Street in North London. Those changes were made as part of a larger infrastructure project when the street was dug up. And I think people should also understand that those things will come together and that we won't be, I assume, running around just retrofitting streets unless there's other work there to be done.
Who wants to handle this one?
Madam Chair, that is correct. So we would be using this as a tool as part of infrastructure renewal. We also will be using this as a tool as we build new neighborhoods with the development community. So we're not continuing to add to an inventory of future streets councilors get complaints about people speeding on.
So I want to thank you for this. I think it's very helpful. It's a great tool for elected officials to use and say, here's the approach we're going to use in the future. And I think anything where we say, look, this is long-term, not a short-term fix, I think that's always good. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Squire. I have Councillor Usher, Park, Deputy Mayor Hubert, and Councillor Helmer next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions, very easy, but I'll pick up on where Councillor Squire left off. Because all my years on council, I've had complaints about speeding and about congestion. Those are the two big issues for the residential area. And most of my ward, most of all our wards are residential. We have a few arterial streets going through them. And I don't have the answer, and I'm not so sure that we have the magic answer for many of these places. Some of the crescents, they are a little bit luckier, but some of the streets, they do get a lot of flow through. In the south, for example, we get a lot of traffic coming from the Lambeth area, coming through into the White Oaks area to come downtown or go to the hospital. And it's a pain for people to deal with this. And I get this constantly. I get it so much now that I can't even pass it to staff anymore because I know that staff is doing their best. But each individual one is extremely difficult to work on. So I'm hoping that what Mr. McRae is talking about will work for all of these. But at the same time, it's the residents who live in the area who feels it. And I have to tell you that some of them who get less speed complain more than some of them who get more speed. So it's a matter of how the individuals feel about it. Some of them just move in and all of a sudden they experience this speed. But in some cases, it's congestion. So I just hope that this, I mean, this is not something new, but it's brought to our attention now as a whole, and it certainly helps us understand and see how you design these things. So I just ask you to bear this in mind because I know that I send a lot of stuff over to you with respect to speeding, congestion, but more so the speeding. And you have to understand, we had a, through you, Madam Chair, we had a meeting specifically on traffic in my ward some time ago, and some of your staff were there. And it's enormous, the complaints that we had. We had to have this because we were getting so many complaints, but they still ask, what are we doing about this? What are we doing about this? What are we doing about this street? And every time they mention a street to me, I know that there's another street that is worse. But part of it is because, I'm saying, is because it's a flow-through area, mostly from that growing area of Lambeth that is coming through the center and trying to get downtown or trying to get to the hospital on Commissioners Road. So that's just my statement to follow up on that, and I hope that you could take that into consideration. I don't know what we're going to do about some of this congestion, but the right-of-way that you mentioned in the speech, what I want to know is, do we control how the utilities utilize the right-of-way underground on these complete streets? And the reason I ask that is because I'm hoping that they get in there and we give them a certain width to utilize and they use that and they don't have to come back afterwards and dig up the street or the sidewalk. So for new streets or for rehabilitation streets, do we control the area that they use? Could you tell me, through you, Madam Chair?
I'll look to staff for that. I know what I suspect, but I'm curious to hear.
The relationship with the utility companies is, each one is unique, and they are often with provincially and or federally regulated. So they do have their certain powers. The telecoms are typically provincial, gas companies, provincial or federal. That said, we do have a very good working relationship with them here in London. The Utility Coordinating Committee is a very functional forum that brings city staff and all the utility companies together into a room on a bi-weekly basis, every 2 weeks. And all of the capital projects flow through that, both city capital projects, but also the utility companies. So it's a good forum, and it was a useful forum for us to vet the Complete Streets design manual through to get their feedback. Obviously, everything on the surface is important, but equally important is the underground utilities and allocating space and trying to make reconstructions as efficient and least disruptive to the public as possible. So yes, we do have a certain, there's a process there to try to coordinate and allocate space efficiently. That said, the utility companies do have authorities that enable them at the end of the day to occupy our right of way, and with that comes certain rights that they have.
Thank you. I know that they do, and I respect that, and I appreciate you saying so. One of my early jobs as an engineer, we used to build the conduits underground for Bell Canada, my early years with Bell. And we used to ensure that we get it under the sidewalk, in new subdivision that is. The developer used to map it out. They show where the streets would be, where the sidewalks would be, and that's where the utility would go. But sometimes I see in this day and age, sometimes, not necessarily in this area, sometimes I see utilities going off that given path. And I think that that's probably what happened to us in places like Dundas Street over the 100 years that's been there. They come and they go wherever they feel like. So I just wanted to be sure that we coordinate it and that we have that committee that you talk about, that we still are able to work through that. My last question is much more simple, and it's to do with Rogers. I didn't see you mention Rogers here at all. Rogers has become a large utility to deal with. At one time, they used to go through Bell and they rent conduits from Bell to go underground, but I believe that they bury some of their cables now. Do we coordinate with them also separately?
Yes, Rogers is a significant utility in town, as you mentioned, and they are a member of the utility coordinating committee. The stakeholders that Michelle mentioned in her presentation was a snapshot, an example, but and I think a lot of them specifically came out to the Complete Streets workshop that we held. That said, the Complete Streets team also went to UCC and got feedback from all of the utility companies, including Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Usher. Councillor Park.
Thank you. I know this is something that I'm working on for quite some time, and I'm liking what I'm seeing in terms of the Complete Streets and intersections also, because it's just very clearly allocated spaces where everyone will be safe and they can all get about the town as they need to. One of the difficulties when we go forward, as we know, London's a city of a river and railroad tracks, and a lot of neighborhoods which are over 100 years old in some places, and those narrow right-of-ways are going to be the most difficult points where we might have those conflicts between making sure we have separated bike lanes and all those sorts of things. But another thing that I really do like is the lack of impediment to through traffic on corridors like let's take, for example, Richmond North, where a lot of the hindrance for people in vehicles right now is someone stopping to make a left or a right turn. With this plan, making sure that through traffic's not hindered. And when we move forward with rapid transit, recognizing that with the curbside buses, I think that would be a big hindrance to vehicles entering into neighborhoods and that sort of thing. So I think this is a really comprehensive view about mobility choices in London and making sure that people have those choices, because at this point in the time right now, we don't really have those choices if, as a woman cyclist, may not feel safe if there's no sort of infrastructure in place. I want to thank the staff and the consultants and the community input that's been a long slog on this project, and I look forward to how we're going to grow the city in future years with this plan in place.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Deputy Mayor Hubert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of comments. I think what's really good here is we have principles and we have priorities, and those allow us to navigate the conflicts or the tensions. Councillor Park used the word conflicts, I refer to them as tensions, because sometimes you can't have everything that you want to have, and you have to kind of navigate those difficult discussions. I guess one of the questions I have is, and bearing the scars of some of the road work in neighborhoods like in Oak Ridge Acres, where we had the infamous East Mile, West Mile sidewalk conflict of 18 months ago. Project seems to be going really well once people kind of get over it. We had to make some flexibility around it has to be this way. You know, we have to have a boulevard here, and we ended up navigating or negotiating the tension. Does Complete Streets, because it looks at all of the different types of streets, address those kinds of issues in terms of sidewalk or no sidewalk or sidewalk on one side, or is that under a different rubrics?
Through the chair, Complete Streets is a tool that staff can use to help prioritize how we assign space to various road users at various locations and give us design options to do so. It is important to remember, though, that the legislative piece that actually requires, wherever possible, two-sided sidewalks and one side with the boulevard where two is not possible is actually the London plan in terms of the framework legally. This will continue to be, I think, a conversation for the next council. Certainly, we remember many sidewalk debates over the last 18 months or so, and it's always a difficult conversation when you change somebody's local street.
Right. With the greatest respect to engineers, it's important that it's a conversation and not a legislative. As you said, our preference would be two-sided sidewalks. If not able, it's one-sided. And how that happens, that's a conversation, which means these are principles. Yes, I get what the London plan says. I get what ADOA says. But at the end of the day, there's a conversation that has to happen with the community, which is, I think, Councillor Squire's point. And at the end of the day, we come up with the best possible solution, balancing all of those things. They're not the 10 Commandments that can't, or well, unfortunately, 10 Commandments actually get broken, but shouldn't be broken. Let's just put it that way.
Through the chair, we certainly in engineering are working with planning and legal around the implications of how the London plan was worded and approved, because it is quite prescriptive that we should at least have a sidewalk on one side of all streets. Now, I actually strongly agree that it needs to be a conversation and there needs to be community judgment and input as well as good technical judgment in making those decisions. So we are looking for ways to have that conversation with a greater degree of flexibility for all involved.
So I think that even in this manual, the scorecarding type of approach where you get to see it's not just this one point, but there's these competing issues in tension that have to be dealt with. That's, I think, a good way of approaching it.
Thank you. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. In terms of how the pavement widths will compare for the local streets, so what is currently a local street and what in the future will be a neighborhood street, it seems like the suggestion is that the neighborhood streets will be 7.5 meters. The current local streets vary quite a bit, but some of them are not as wide as that and some of them are a bit wider. How do we figure out what the minimum width was going to be for those neighborhood streets? I think from the design guidelines, the most narrow street was 6 meters pavement width, and then 7, and then 8, depending on how many units are on the street. But I just wonder if our staff could speak to, there's a lot of streets out there now that are wider than this. There are some, very few probably, that are narrower. And what are people going to perceive when they look at a 7.5 meter wide street?
Yeah, so the width of local streets, now called neighborhood streets, is really a trade-off of through accessibility, and with that, emergency services are a key stakeholder, and then also local use such as on-street parking. So there is an acknowledgement that currently streets get built a little too wide. We hear that from concerns that Councillor Squire was referring to with respect to speeds. So the guide does make a suggestion for narrowing, typically a half a meter narrower than our current requirements. And the sense there is that, you know, this shouldn't affect the amount of on-street parking significantly, but still enable it and bring those through speeds down. So it's more of a more conducive, more in line with neighborhood division.
Thank you. Councillor Van Holst, I think you have the last word.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I think this is a good path forward with the narrowing of the streets, because of course people are driving with a mind of potential threats, and when you're driving down some local streets, you're essentially in the middle of a road with a lane and a half on either side of you, and then a boulevard, and then two sidewalks, and then a long driveway and a yard, and you can see 300 meters ahead, and there's usually no one on the streets. So there are no perceivable threats, and people just feel comfortable driving faster because they could respond to anything that might happen in that adequately. However, as they get more narrow and you're closer to cars, it does make a big difference. Having lived and driven in Ireland, where the lanes are so thin that at every moment you're at risk of losing your side view mirrors, and along the side of the street you can always find some that have been sheared off. I had one on my coffee table as a knickknack. That really does keep the drivers more focused, and you tend to slow down. So we won't be getting that far, but it does have that effect for sure. My question then, just about the cycling lanes. Although it's great to have those, there's people that would prefer not to be on the street, on the same street as the cars when they're cycling. What other options have we got there? I see some pictures where the cyclists are on the street, and some where they're away from the street. What could some of those people with the concern expect with the Complete Streets plan?
Through the chair, the evolution of cycling facility design is captured in its most up-to-date form in the Complete Streets Manual, and the city continues to stay current in that regard. The latest update to the Ontario Traffic Manual that guides the design of cycling facilities considers a context-sensitive approach to cycling facilities. And that's really in line with what we're talking about here with Complete Streets. So on busier roads, the roads that, arterial roads, so the civic boulevards, the urban thoroughfares, as the London plan refers to them, they're so busy that a hesitant, what the kind of cyclist that's referred to as interested but concerned would really prefer to be separated from the motor vehicle traffic. And so the facilities proposed on those kinds of streets in the Complete Streets Manual have those cycling facilities behind a curb, and they're carefully shown so that they integrate with the transit users and sidewalks, such to minimize conflicts. But it does separate the cycling facilities away from traffic to make them more safe and more appealable to the interested but concerns. It also goes further in that it introduces a concept for bike lanes on neighborhood connector streets. So that those are streets known as collectors. And that is, as Michelle mentioned in her presentation, a new concept, and that a lot of our collector streets are good cycling routes, and they form good alternatives to the busy arterial roads. So this would make those more appealable from a cycling perspective, and a future update to the cycling master plan would consider which of those routes, based on their routing and origin destinations that they connect, which of those routes would be in line for this sort of approach of having bike lanes on collector streets.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that answer because it was a very short synopsis of what people, I think, are really looking for. And the cyclists I'm talking with would feel very comfortable with this approach. So thank you.
Thank you. So this can be moved by Councillor Usher? No? Councillor Park? Okay, Councillor Usher will move it. And Deputy Mayor Hubert, thank you. The vote is open on screen.
Closing the vote, motion passed 5-0.
Okay, thank you very much. And just a reminder with the system, before we can put the vote on screen, I do need to find someone that agrees to move and second it, which is why I'm constantly scanning and calling out names. So if it's a non-contentious issue, I'm just looking for someone that will volunteer to be the mover and seconder. We will move forward to item 3.2, which is Adelaide Street North CPR Grade Separation Environmental Study Report. Ms. Scher, who will be managing this?
Madam Chair, Mr. McRae has a brief presentation to make, and then we'd be pleased to take questions.
Thank you, and I think having more time for questions is more important, I think, than a lengthy presentation, because I'm sure that the committee has a number of questions.
Noted. Okay, thank you. I will keep this brief. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the project team that is here. We have Artie Inspiu, Josh Hackworth, Gilly Thompson from WSP, and I'd also like to acknowledge the big role that the local community associations played in this project. There's been a big role for the Oldies Village Community Association, the Oldies Village BIA, the Woodfield and Piccadilly community associations. They've really helped the project team. They've been part of the project team. They've really helped broadcast this project out to their members and the communities. And we've had a working group essentially that has had productive discussions, and it's been really helpful and really improved the project a lot. So the project has its roots in previous rail studies and the Smart Moves Transportation Master Plan, and it's identified in the development charges background study in the longer term. But a year ago, an amendment case brought the timing of the project forward to the near term, to a 3 to 5 year time frame in last year's budget cycle. So the road, Adelaide Street, accommodates over 25,000 motor vehicles a day, as well as numerous pedestrians, cyclists. The train delays number on average about 20 times per day and frequently exceed 2 hours in total duration. So there's a real need here and significant impacts to road users, both from a safety perspective, safety of pedestrians, cyclists, motorists, and the reliability of emergency services and transit services. With the project comes a lot of opportunities. We're able to improve safety, improve planning for emergency services and transit. There's been a big focus on the streetscape and improving, making enhancements to the streetscape wherever possible and integrating the heritage character of the surrounding neighborhoods, and also providing an improved active transportation connection across the rail corridor. In broad terms, it's the environmental assessment is recommending an underpass. The underpass is shorter, so has a smaller footprint, so it's able to maintain connectivity better with side streets. It reduces noise for the surrounding neighborhoods, more attractive to pedestrians and cyclists, and I'll be able to illustrate that in future slides. And it just basically fits with the neighborhood context much better and is preferred by the public from what we heard during the public sessions for the project. So this is a plan view of the recommended concept. The new rail bridge is at the center of the slide. Adelaide Street goes across the page with north on the right side of the screen. It reinstates the 4 lanes on Adelaide Street, introduces turn lanes at Central Avenue, and it's able to connect the 2 legs of Central Avenue better to actually improve connectivity across the Adelaide Street corridor. The intersections have pillar and post features to really tie in with the surrounding architecture. There will be terrace plantings throughout the project. The interaction with the McMahon Park is a key focus area for the project. There will be access points towards the south, close to the railway, and then up close to McMahon, the primary entrance is going to be reconfigured facing the McMahon Street intersection, and the pedestrian signal will be relocated to tie in with that. It's not as easy to connect Paul Mall and McMahon Street. So Paul Mall, given its proximity to the grade separation in the grades, becomes a right-in, right-out configuration, but still maintains connectivity to Adelaide Street. This is a concept of what the bridge would look like. It'll be a steel through girder, so it'll look very similar to what has recently been constructed on Warrencliffe Road north of Oxford Street. Same type of bridge design. And then this slide also shows the active transportation routes, in that we went through several iterations with the advisory committee and the public on how best to provide a short active walking and cycling connection across the rail corridor, and the multi-use path, so a wide 4-meter pathway terraced up above the roadway was the concept that we landed on after talking that through with all the interested parties. And that's why this is more favorable than an overpass as well, and that it reduces the amount of grades that pedestrians and cyclists need to grapple with. The slide also shows the sort of terrace landscaping on the right side there that will be introduced through much of the project to just sort of break down the grade separation. This just is a little more detail on those side street connections. So it shows Central Avenue, where there was a minimal offset made for an awkward intersection. A lot of feedback that the communities on either side of Adelaide didn't want to be disconnected. So we're able to actually improve that at Central Avenue. At Paul Mall and McMahon Street, the offset is such that significant property impacts would occur if this were tried to be implemented. So we're not able to do it there, but we're providing improved connections to the park, and again relocating that pedestrian signal at McMahon to tie in with the park entrance gateway feature that'll be shifted close to the intersection. The project construction is likely going to take 2 years. We always look at during big projects like this at how to mitigate the impacts of this to road users and the surrounding communities. The good news here is that a temporary road detour is possible. And there is a corridor down the east side of the road that is required for utility relocations, underground utilities. So it goes across the park frontage and across the commercial lands to the south of the railway. So the road detour is going to use that disturbed area in a temporary basis, post-project, it'll be reinstated, so the park frontage would be reinstated afterwards. In interacting with Canadian Pacific Railway, we have become aware that the road detour is somewhat complex in that because we're on the edge of the rail yard, there are moving components to the rail infrastructure and moving components that cannot be paved over. So we're really sort of threading the needle of a narrow width for this road detour to pass through. And as such, the road detour will be limited to 2 lanes. Our traffic analysis indicates that this combined with turn lanes at either end, that it'll convey about 70% of the traffic capacity. The bottom line here is that 4 lanes is just not possible. CPR staff have identified significant concerns with train stability if we start introducing turns into their rails. The cost of the project coming in at $58.3 million. This fits within the amendment case, the budget item that was introduced in last capital budget cycle. And finally, upon presuming council approval of the environmental assessment and then the subsequent 30-day public review period, this wraps up the environmental assessment phase. After this, the project would proceed into detailed design and property acquisition. There are, I forgot to mention, there's 17 property acquisitions, 17 different parcels, a lot of which are widening strips off the frontage of properties, 4 of which are buyouts. So there's interactions that need to take place with property owners. And subsequent to that, implementation of the project in the 2021-2022 timeframe. So with that, I'll wrap up my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I started speakers list. I have Councillor Park and then Usher and then everybody. We'll start with Councillor Park.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I remember when we first discussed going forward with the EA, and I, at that time, talked about a lot of the concerns I had heard from my constituents in both Woodfield and Pana. And one of the biggest concerns that they had was a potential loss of connectivity with the neighborhoods east of Adelaide Street, because McMahon Park plays a big role in either of those neighborhoods. The plan that we see here today not only maintains those connections, but improves it in a way that is huge. I think that there's been so much advocacy from both sides of Adelaide Street on here, and I see a lot of synergies between everybody coming together and a real sense that people have been heard through this project based upon what we're seeing here today. What we're seeing in this project is not only like infrastructure renewal, we're also seeing placemaking, which is amazing. Seeing those improvements to the landscape along this particular stretch in Adelaide Street would be a very welcome thing for the neighborhoods there. I have absolutely nothing negative to say about this other than no one wants to go through a 2-year construction project, but what's going to happen at the end of it will be well worth the wait for 2 years. So I want to thank the members of the public, the BIAs that have been involved, and the staff and the consulting team. This is a project where I think that everyone's very much nodding in agreement on.
I think the 2 most common things I hear from constituents when they meet me is obviously the first one, they usually say, I thought you'd be taller when I met you in person. The second usually is...
How's that working out?
I hear that a lot. The second is that how eager they are to see this project go ahead. And I think that's the important thing from my ward's point of view, is just that it's going to solve so many issues for the Old North neighborhood in terms of cut-through traffic. Even now, we're doing some construction on Adelaide, and it is absolutely incredible the number of cars that are coming into the neighborhood to find an alternative route. And in years past, they did that. They would come right off on Huron, go up William Street to avoid Adelaide Street. So this is really going to be great moving forward. I don't have anything at all negative to say about it. I think it's going to make the area better. I think the streets are going to be better. And I was going to ask questions about the 2-year construction, but you've got a detour in place, which is really important. And I relate that a little bit to the project that's also going on Western Road in my ward, which I also think is another terrific project. Originally, there was supposed to be closure there on the railway for, I think, 9 months. It was supposed to be inaccessible, and that was reduced down so there was no inaccessibility. So I think as Londoners, we have to accept that if we're going to make the kind of changes we have to make, we're going to have to put up with the construction to some extent. There's nothing we can really do about that. So moving forward, I love this project, and I think staff deserves a lot of credit for getting this moved up from the 2030 date up to a more acceptable date. And that I think is all on staff and the work that you've done. So thanks to you.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. To summarize, short-term pain, long-term gain. And this is not, and while with respect to my two colleagues from Ward 6 and 13, I hear it as much as you guys probably do as well. This is a city project in the entire city. Unfortunately, some colleagues that I work with that are not here will now no longer have the excuse to be late for meetings, because it's almost an urban legend that you can say, I got stuck behind a train in London, and that would excuse you from being late for a business meeting. So I look forward to that. Although I was so out of town last week, and I was rather surprised by a number. I know we're into election season, so I'm going to make a comment. A number of candidates suggesting that part of their central platform would be the building of the underpass on Adelaide Street. And it shocked me because, first of all, it was part of the 2014 Smart Moves master plan, transportation master plan. And secondly, this council has moved the timeline up 10 years. And here we have a completed environmental assessment that is ready to go for 30-day review, and then budget in the next year. And I think that's very positive. So to suggest that this council in any way, shape, or form has been...
I have to caution you. Thank
you. But to suggest that we have not been proactive on this and staff have not been working very hard on this is disingenuous. So I was disappointed to see that last week, and so I wanted to make sure that the record was very clear, as it is in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Usher.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, I'm going to thank staff very, very much for this presentation. It answers a lot of questions for those who want to try to bring it forward closer before 2021. It certainly shows that there's a lot of work to be done in order to get there in the first place. But I also want to point out that this is not a new project. You know, we did Hale Trafalgar over 10 years ago, and this was one of the priority projects that we talked about. We'd have liked both of them at the same time. Couldn't do them because Hale Trafalgar was, I think it was $80 million at that time. Today it would probably be closer to 36. But we had to get Hale Trafalgar done first, and Adelaide was the next step. Unfortunately, we put Adelaide way out into 2030, and now we're bringing it into 2021. And my satisfaction with this more than anything else is that I, on behalf of the City of London, the citizens of London, would definitely like to see this done before BRT. Because if nothing else, I think that having this, it will help a great deal when we start dealing with BRT and construction along Richmond. So I think it's deserving that it's advanced the way it has been advanced. It will definitely, a lot of people will definitely be happy with it because it will solve some of the congestion problems. And one of the things that you don't know it until you really feel it. One day last week, or a week before last, I can't remember which one, I was coming from King's College, and it was about 9:45 in the morning, and I had to pass through. I decided to take Adelaide, because I had to go down to Goodwill on Adelaide Street. And I tell you that I passed the train track, and just when I got there, the bars came down. And I thought, okay, so the train will just pass through. And yeah, the train passed through and stopped right in the middle. The front of the engine stopped right in the middle of the road. And then went back east. And then came back west. And then went back east. And then came back west. And one cart went west. And then went back east. And that was the shunting. But it took 12 minutes to do that. It wasn't passing through. It was just shunting. And you know, I really don't think that that was the original use of the tracks. I know that they have to do the shunting. I fully understand that. But gosh, you know, if they could just do that shunting about 200 yards east and stop there, it would benefit a whole lot of people, because that shunting alone keep a lot of people out, and that's a lot of things in the economy. So I just brought that to the attention because I don't know if that's anything that we could do about the shunting itself. I do accept the fact that we have the tracks and they need to pass through. When we did Hail Trafalgar, it was in order to help with that shunting. More than anything else, it was the shunting that was affecting Hail Trafalgar. But I don't think it affected Adelaide that much at that time. And if I experienced that on one or two occasions, a lot of people do. My last statement or question is to do with the diagram on page 178. And the implication of this diagram, and if you read the papers this morning, you'll see a letter to the editor talking about this, addressing this. And it says that we are going with the underpass starting at Oxford to Queens. And I think that that person must have been looking at this diagram. So why is it that we show this diagram? Because people looking at this in the public will think that this is the area that the slope starts. Can you explain that to me? Through you, Madam Chair.
Mr. McCrae, can you explain the diagram about the EA study area?
Yes, through the chair. When an environmental assessment is started, it is uncertain what the final recommendations will be coming out of it. So the study area needs to be sufficiently broad in order to encompass all potential alternatives and not preclude anything. And it also needs to be able to consider any sort of social, cultural, natural environment features that are in the surrounding area. So that study area diagram is quite typical of all environmental assessments in that it's carried through from commencement right through to completion, and that is the area that's looked at, even though the recommended alternative at the end of it is confined to a much smaller footprint.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad Mr. McCrae said that in public, because it's very important that we understand that this is just the study area, but the actuality of the underpass will start closer to central to the other side, in between those two streets nearest to the tracks, right? Okay. Thanks very much to staff for this work, and I certainly appreciate the fact that this is coming soon and that it will come before we have BRT in full progress along Richmond Street. At least I think it will. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much, and through you to staff, thanks for that clarification. This is, I think this is great work on a crucial project, and every Londoner who has got better things to do than wait for a train is going to be thrilled. Everyone I talk to is thrilled about it when I describe it to them. My question, just for those who live in the area, because we've got this detour and it's only going to be 2 lanes, some of the local streets may take up some of the slack. So perhaps staff could just describe how they anticipate traffic to flow around this and what they might be doing to calm that. I know in Hamilton Road, we've got some traffic calming through the local streets to make sure that people aren't speeding through there. And that whole process was a little surprise to a couple people. So maybe if we can describe that briefly, those in the neighborhood will be prepared and know what to expect.
Sure.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For a project like this, typically we'll look at a combination of giving people great information so they can avoid the area altogether, and then providing some relief to local residents through things like temporary traffic calming. We don't have a detour plan beyond the large detour that's shown right adjacent to the roadway done yet. We're not at that phase, but those would be the types of things you would expect, along with communication to the neighborhood as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Helmer, you have the last word.
Thank you, and my colleagues have covered a number of things that are good about the project. I wanted to say to our staff that I remember when it was first started, the environmental assessment, many of the folks in the community, especially in Old East Village, said if we're going to put a grade separation here, it better be the best grade separation we've seen anywhere in the city, and an example to all kinds of other places about how to do a grade separation properly. I think because of the experience with the overpass further south on Adelaide, people were very concerned that we would end up with something that was, you know, on the cheaper side and easy to construct and didn't have any impacts on storm sewers and other sewer things underground, but that would cut off the neighborhoods, so to further divide Woodfield and Old East Village, impact access into the park, and not really help pedestrians and cyclists who really don't want to go over a hill to get to the other side. So I'm really glad that we have landed on an underpass that is actually getting in that direction. So it's really well designed. We have good, I think the multi-use path is better, even as recently as the Public Information Center. We're still looking at maybe cyclists coming down the roadway. And I'm glad that we're saying, let's just stay on the elevated multi-use path through the intersection, through the underpass. That's gonna work a lot better than getting down on the roads with the cars. And, you know, I think the temporary detour certainly is good from a perspective of keeping traffic moving during the construction. It is going to have significant impacts on the park. So we're putting a road basically through a park, and then we're going to have to rebuild it afterwards. So I do have a couple of questions about that aspect of it, and I wonder if our staff can just speak to that. So in terms of the temporary impacts on the park and restoration, all of that, including the landscaping for the project itself, that's all included in this budget, the 59.9 million?
Madam Chair, yes, it is.
And right now, I think we're looking at basically 2 years of the park being impacted. If you look at the overview, we saw, you know, the road is going to be pretty close to the play structure, and it seems to me like that's going to probably impair the park for a long period of time where people really won't be able to use it very comfortably. And so afterwards, are we going to use this as an opportunity to upgrade the infrastructure that's in the park? I know this is not a parks project, but once we rip things up and we start going in there, is there going to be a separate thing which is related to the park, and when it gets restored, making sure it's a really good park?
So Madam Chair, as noted, we do have budget to reinstate the park, and you will see in the enhanced landscaping and streetscape that was shown in the image there. In terms of general upgrades to the amenity of the park, that is not included in this particular budget. My understanding is my colleagues in Parks and Rec are looking at some improvements to the wading pool as well in a future year, but upgrades beyond reinstatement and the streetscape enhancements that are for the whole project are not included.
Thank you. And if in the happy circumstance that there is a, say, a project surplus for this one, and it seems to be trending a little bit under so far, I know it was 59.9 and now it's 58 something, which is, it's going in the right direction. If there is a small project surplus, is that potentially a source, imagining that the actual source of financing match up, where if there is a parks project, we could perhaps transfer them?
So, Madam Chair, typically if we have a project that comes in under budget, those surplus funds are returned to the original source of funding. There is mill rate funding involved in this project under the current 2017 amendment. It's about $17 million. If some of that funding were left over at the end, and council were to direct us to do so, that could be provided to parks, but it would require council approval. Otherwise, it would go back into the source accounts and would go through a regular budget process for allocation.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you very much. So I wanted to ask about the edges of the study area. I'm glad that it came up earlier because I know there's some discussion in the actual environmental study report itself about findings related to Oxford and Adelaide and some findings related to Queens and Adelaide. And essentially those are not being dealt with through the underpass project, but they're, especially Oxford and Adelaide, that are identified as this requires its own separate EA out in the future. And I wonder if our staff could speak to the timeline for that. I know it's an important intersection. It's under construction right now for other reasons, but I wonder if people could get a sense of when we might be looking at that in more detail.
Through the chair, the Smart Moves Transportation Master Plan identified a need for optimization on the Adelaide Street corridor, all the way from Fanshawe Park Road down to Hamilton Road. So when we got into the details of this grade separation EA, there was an acknowledgement that there's some pretty challenging spots, and you know, the two that you mentioned at Queens Avenue and at Oxford Street, both those intersections have needs, but as we worked it through the grade separation EA, we thought it best to undertake a holistic approach for that whole optimized corridor that was identified for optimization. So our plan is to start a study on that, and it may not necessarily be an environmental assessment at the outset, but just a broad corridor assessment of highlighting where the best opportunities are, where the needs, opportunities, constraints are throughout the corridor, and hone our efforts in on where they can be done in a context-sensitive manner. So the Smart Moves Transportation Master Plan identified that in the longer term, but our thoughts are to start that study in the shorter term, just so we can get a plan in place to implement all improvements where possible, and probably through a phased manner over a number of years. So there's no set timing on that study, but suffice to say that it is on the radar and something that we plan to do in the fairly near term.
Just a brief follow-up, that's very helpful. In terms of the actual intersections and the collisions that we're seeing in those intersections, I know that they were both red light camera intersections. I think Queens went earlier. I'm not sure actually if Oxford Adelaide is operating it. I think it is, but have we noticed any improvements in the intersection performance since those red light cameras have gone in? I know it's a bit early to be talking about the program overall, but those two I thought I'd ask.
Through the chair, the red light camera at Adelaide and Queens Avenue is in place just over a year. And we will be reporting back later in the fall with overall how the program is run. But looking at the collisions, the number of collisions at that intersection in the past year is down slightly from before. We would expect that downward trend to continue. Right, 1 year is it's 1 year worth of data. The other intersection up at Oxford Street, the red light camera equipment's all being installed. Due to the construction that's currently there, it hasn't actually been turned on yet.
Okay, I need a mover and a seconder. Park and Usher, thank you. We'll put that up on screen.
Closing the vote, motion passed 5-0.
Thank you. The last item left is item 4.1. Ms. Sher, did you want to speak to this briefly or nothing? Oh, in the back, hold on. Do we have a microphone in use?
Through you, Madam Chair, it's a pleasure to be here at Civic Works. I don't get an opportunity to come to this committee very often. What you have before you today is a request to hold a public participation meeting to rename two essential stub streets of Pleasant View Drive. This is arising out of a consent application. As one of the conditions of the consent was to actually proceed with the renaming of the street. The applicant will be, if the public participation meeting generates positive comments, the applicant will be responsible for compensating property owners for their costs associated with the renaming and paying for street signs as well. So happy to take any further questions.
I've got a mover in Councillor Usher and a seconder in Deputy Mayor Hubert. I don't know if anyone has any questions, and welcome to Civic Works. So we'll put that up for a vote. If everyone can vote on screen, we can actually wrap up our meeting.
Closing the vote, motion passed 5-0.
Great. So we took care of additional business earlier. I need a motion to adjourn.
No, I received deferred.
Oh, yes, we should receive the deferred matters list as well. Moved by Park, seconded by Hubert. Oh, questions on deferred matters list, of course. Go ahead. Can you try the microphone button again, Councillor?
First item number 1. It says the expected date is the second quarter, 2018. Can we change that? It's in progress, right? Is there a better date?
Madam Chair, the report is finished and we are recommending referral to the service review process. There have been some changes to the service review process that we're waiting on finalization. So we're obviously not going to make the second quarter. So we certainly could change that to the end of the year would be perfect.
So Madam Chair, may I just suggest we remove that and just leave the in progress?
Well, I think it still needs to come back. It's a matter of whether or not we refer it. So when could a report come back with a recommendation to refer?
The report is complete. I need to meet with our city treasurer about how it's going to integrate into the process for a bit of language. It should be able to come in September, actually, so.
Yeah, so why leave the second quarter there? That's my point.
Can you revise it to be
leave it in
third quarter?
progress? Just leave it empty and say in progress.
Councillor, this was raised a little while ago, and there was the intent of having dates, even though they may need to be revised, was not just to leave things hanging out there, but to show council when they're expected to come back.
Okay, you have an explanation. I'm not going to make a big deal about it. I just thought I would mention it. We got quite a few of these with Mr. Solder's name. Should we leave it as Mr. Solder, or should we remove them? About 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah, I would expect that once we appoint a new director of roads, that we would update that. Ms. Sher, do you have any further information?
Madam Chair, at this time, staff who were assigned the work are continuing with the work. We anticipate we'll continue to meet those scheduled dates and report back with them as planned. We will add a new name once we have a new name.
An answer for everything. Yeah. He's not here anymore, so. Item number 13. That's also said the second quarter of 2018. Is there a new date for that?
That was reported out at the last meeting and can be removed.
Well, I should say both 11 and 13. My point is that this is August. It's not the second quarter. We've passed the second quarter. So should we have a new date? That's all I'm asking.
Right. It's done though. So I think that what you're pointing out, Councillor Usher, is that perhaps before the next meeting, staff can go through the deferred matters list, make sure it's updated, and things that are already completed are moved off. So for item 13, we received an update at the last meeting, and so that is now completed. So it will just come off the list.
And 11?
Madam Chair, item 11 will come to the September meeting.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions on the deferred matters list? Seeing none, can I have a motion to adjourn?
Do we have to vote on it?
Oh, receipt, sorry. Okay, Deputy Mayor Hubert is voting manually.
Closing the vote, motion passed 5-0.
Okay, folks, for the third time, I'll try this. Can we have a motion to adjourn? Park, second by Usher, all in favor. Any opposed? That carries, we are adjourned. Have a great couple of weeks.